Hello and welcome to yet another video, and in this video I'll be talking about this camera right here. It's the Nikon D5000. Yes, this camera has been out for a little while now, I know, but not long ago I was looking for my new setup for my budget photography series videos. Yes, I haven't really made a lot of those videos, but I'm planning to really get back to it this time, and I found this setup for like 50 euros and I decided to actually buy it and put it through its paces. So now I'm actually making a video about this camera based on my experience shooting with it. And yes, this camera will make more of its appearance in my later budget photography videos. But in this video, I would like to talk about the pros and cons on this camera if you're considering about, getting this camera for budget photography or just really shoot around, what have you. So without further ado, let's get into the video. So the Nikon D5000, this camera has been out for a little while now, I know, but this camera in my opinion is still very, very capable of producing really, really nice images. In this video, I'll be talking about the build quality, the operational side of things on this camera, how it feels like to use it, as well as the image quality, touch upon like minor bit of the video quality on this camera, and then leading into my conclusion. So first, let me talk about the build quality as well as the operational side of things. So the build quality is very plasticky, to be honest, but it also really is a small and compact DSLR. Of course, the lens will add extra size to the camera, but like if you're just considering about the camera itself, it's a really small, nice and compact camera in your hand. If you have big hands, you might not feel comfortable about using this camera because it has a really small grip and the grip is not deep either, but you can definitely get used to that over time, especially when you can actually find it for around 50 euros nowadays. It shouldn't really be a matter of like having good ergonomics. So, but talking about the ergonomics itself, it does actually feel, as I mentioned earlier, plasticky, but in the same time comfortable, like how your thumb actually rests over here, because you can actually easily reach a lot of the controls over here, whether it's the dials or the D-pad, the live view. They're actually very essential. And onto the left side over here are also another essential sets of buttons, like the menu, the info, the playback, the rubbish button. So yeah, the on-off button is also on the side, so you can actually a lot of time operate this camera with one hand, just flick on and then the camera turns on. There's sensor cleaning as well, which is great. The screen behind here is actually a 2.7 inch, I believe, screen, which also rotates as your camera rotates to its orientation. So it's also really nice. But a lot of times, if I bring it up to my eye, then I just hit the button up here, the info button, so that the screen actually switches off. So that's another downside here, is that there's no sensor to actually switch off the screen when you bring your eye up to the viewfinder. And also, being a small viewfinder that is pretty much flat to the body here, it means that your nose will be poking onto the screen very often. It's not a touch screen, but it does feel a bit uncomfortable, and also if the screen remains on, then it does kind of hurt your eye a little bit depending on the lighting condition. While we're on the display topic, the display is nice, bright and really clear for such an old camera, to be honest. But if you're outside taking like sunset pictures, things like that, then some of the shots can look like you're actually taking black and white shots when you're actually not. And if you're like in an environment where the light is very contrasty and things like that, I would really recommend using this screen to only really judge your framing and your exposure. Don't judge your colors on it, because the colors will look a little bit weird. Because a lot of times when I take this camera out to shoot like sunset, golden hours, things like that, or even sometimes certain lighting in the daylight condition, it just looks black and white, simply because the screen is not bright enough to produce all of the colors to really your eyes would be able to see properly. So it does feel a little bit weird, and I would have to check sometimes that, okay, I'm actually shooting in color, I'm not accidentally pressing any button to change into other color settings. And talking about changing menus, I feel like despite the menu system in here is very well organized, I feel that the buttons are not really good to operate. I don't mean that in that they don't feel good. They do feel very tactile, but for example, the D-pad here, they could actually easily fit more functions onto the D-pad. Like the up button could be like to change your white balance, the side button could be to change your ISO, but in fact you actually have to press the info button here, and then you have to move around the screen to actually change your settings. And if you're working like or if you're taking pictures in an environment where you don't always have time to fiddle with all of these settings, because some of the settings can take a bit more time than others to access, then you could actually miss the shot. And here's the another down point about this camera as well, that the metering system in here is not good. A lot of times you're finding yourself either overexposing or underexposing because of the metering system not being accurate, even compared to like entry-level cameras from other brands like the Canon 1000D, the Canon 500D, the Sony A100. Those cameras will be able to meter the images much more precisely than this camera can. It still can get the job done, but the amount of time it misses like overexposing or underexposing is just way too often compared to the other cameras. So if you're relying on the metering a lot, then I'd say that this camera is not really for you. But if you're a person who can really predict every single settings, from like ISO to shutter speeds and aperture, everything all at once, and you get it accurately like all the time, then sure, then you use this camera. But otherwise, just don't trust the metering. You just have to take a lot of test shots with it. And the next point is actually a positive point. It's the autofocusing system. The autofocusing system in here is great. Let me actually talk about the viewfinder before I get into the full part of the autofocusing system. So if there's no battery in here, the viewfinder actually turns dark and the autofocusing system layout actually shuts off. And that's how you know you don't have the batteries in here. And that's kind of like a unique thing with entry-level cameras that's, oh, it's still on, that's from that generation. Like, it's really, really nice, so you can always know that, before you take your camera out, you'll know right away if you have batteries in here or not, because it happens to some photographers before where, you leave the battery out to charge at home and you only have like one battery because all of your other spare batteries are lost or whatever, and then you just leave the house forgetting that your battery is still on the charger. So having the feature that, the viewfinder actually blacks out, not black out, but like turns darker, and the autofocusing points also disappears, it also is a great sign to know that you don't have a battery in there. But yeah, anyway, now into the autofocusing system. The autofocusing system is actually pretty accurate. I am very, very surprised with the autofocusing system of this camera. Of course, it's not going to be really good in tracking movements, but it is really, really good in like shooting in low light, shooting like even after sunset, things like that. I took this camera to shoot like sunsets a lot, and it never really get confused what subject it should really focus on. Of course, it's not as good and snappy as modern day cameras or even cameras from like 5 years ago, but it is still really, really good for cameras that, existed like when it was built. And I just really don't have a lot to complain about the autofocusing system, because, for the price that you can find nowadays and the subjects like landscapes or even macro photography, it's still pretty good. That being said, the autofocusing system in live view mode is horrible, but that of course is to be expected. A lot of times it will actually not even try to focus accurately, it will just give up. Of course, you could say it depends on the lens, but I've tried with the 50 and the kit lens, but just judging from the live view system, it's already like, you can see that it's the first generation live view system because of how slow it is and how not so reliable it is. It's kind of ironic though, I find, that you can actually do tracking in live view. Like with this camera, there's actually a menu settings for that, but I would never really trust it based on how slow, even with still live, trying to focus on the flowers, this lens is in a proper lighting condition. So yeah. Another neat point is that this camera also has a flash system. Of course, the flash is not completely high, but it is high enough that, physically, if you were to use the onboard flash here, it would, especially with portraits, it would cause less red eye effect. It will still be present, but physically, the higher the flash is, the more red, like the less red eye there will be, if there's any red eye at all. So this is actually kind of like semi-high, so you can still get away with like not having a lot of red eye effects if you're using flash in low light and taking portraits, if that's what you're really into. Otherwise, I really like how the camera really feels, how the button placements on the right hand side are. I kind of disagree with the left hand side here with the placements. I feel like there should be more important buttons on here as well, but you know, like it's a really subjective thing, but it's just my feeling that, you know, they could have made it more customizable with the buttons. Some buttons are customizable, but not really to the features that you can always customize it to. So that is a little bit nitpicking for me, but you know, like if you're really working or taking pictures again in like an environment where you don't want to be caring a lot about your settings, or you don't have time to really set your settings that much, then you know, the buttons layout on this camera is gonna really slow you down a little bit. Of course, if you're like true beginner, you can always go to like some of the fully automated settings or modes up here. But you know, if you're like a little bit more advanced than that, then you'll find that the controls on this camera is a little bit fiddly and a little bit time consuming, and that's not really practical or efficient in the workflow or the work process that you're taking pictures of. And now into the image quality. I don't really have a lot to say about the image quality on this camera because in my opinion, I was really astonished by the image quality you actually can get out of this camera. It's really good. Like, I never expected for like such an old camera to still have a lot of dynamic range. Sometimes when I actually take pictures during the golden light hours or the kind of overcast daylight hours, I feel like, okay, well, sometimes I feel like the highlights might not be able to really be retrieved, or the shadows are already like completely lost. But a lot of times this camera can actually surprise me, like how much highlight this sensor can actually capture and store it onto the actual image files. I'm always surprised. I'm also really amazed by the like color science and the color reproduction out of this camera. Again, I started photography with Nikon, and despite using mainly Canon nowadays, I still have love and respect for both Canon and Nikon, especially their color science as well. And you know, like it kind of brings me back to the day when like Nikon was still like my main camera and everything. And I really love the older Nikon look of the colors as well. It's such a unique digital color that, like, I don't know, it's very subjective, but it's also something like you cannot really find, and it's somehow pleasing to really look at, in my opinion. And it's also really nice to edit because, well, not only the files is also light for modern day computers, but the files are also in the color tone that responds properly, in my opinion, to the color that you set it to, things like that. It's just very easy to tweak. And yeah, it's really nice. And when you use higher ISO, the color doesn't get messed up, or you know, it doesn't really shift that much if you use higher ISO and try to really tweak it. So I really love using the image file. Of course, if you use higher ISO and pull up like shadows to 100%, then of course you will get a lot of noise, and a lot of color noise will also be like present. But you know, if you're only using the images from these cameras to be like posted on social media, whether it's Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, what have you, then you can easily just trade in the resolution and clean up the noise. And you know, if you're just posting on Instagram or Facebook where the image resolution is not really high, then you will not really see the softness. In fact, it will still look quite sharp, and you will be able to do like still do A4 prints, like proper A4 prints with the image out of this camera. So it's really great. The color reproduction out of this camera is also nice. I really love the skin tone, and I don't really have a lot to say about the camera itself. It's great. But of course, it's not going to really win any awards, you know, the images out of this camera. Of course, the creativity could win you the award, but I'm talking about the technicality-wise of the images. It will just not win the camera any awards. And but it will still really deliver really amazing image quality, even in low light. So that's something that I'm really pleased about with this camera. Oh, and it is still on. Anyway, now into the video quality. It shoots up to 720p, and back then it was kind of high, even though the 500D came out with full HD. even though it shoots at 20 frames per second. But you know, 720p is what it is, and it's quite cute in my opinion that it allows you to film two resolutions lower than 720p. So there are actually options to shoot lower than 720p, and I was kind of amazed. Of course, looking at it from like today's point of view, it's kind of like funny and cute to have those features. But you know, back then 720p was like the HD. It is still technically HD, but it was, you know, a bigger deal back then than today's standards. So yeah, but the video is still not really sharp. There's a lot of rolling shutter. There's a lot of moire artifacts, things like that. The dynamic range is very poor. But can you make it work with proper lighting? I think you can make it work. Especially like you can select your focusing subject by just using the manual focus and just be creative with it. It still has the APS-C size sensor, so you are able to get that really nice shallow depth of field compared to your smartphones. So if you're only posting on like Instagram again, you're gonna have really, really nice files to play with, and also play with the focus that your phone cannot really replicate, and just give it a really new look, and it will still look very sharp on social media because it's not really high resolution on there either. So yeah, you can work with it, but there are a lot of limitations compared to even cameras like 5 years ago would have. So take it as what it is, and now into the conclusion. This camera, in my opinion, is a great camera. It has a nice articulating screen, not a fully, well, not modern fully articulating screen, but it is somewhat a fully articulated screen, if that makes sense. If you're taking selfies, this is kind of like a nice convincing effect to like make it seem like you're looking to the lens if you want to just still note your framing, because if you look down, it like psychologically and also visually just, yeah, it's more of a convincing look than if the screen were to flip sideways or upwards. But otherwise, this camera is a really, really well built camera in my opinion. Yes, it is plasticky, but it's not a type of plasticky where, you know, with some entry-level DSLRs like the D3000, for example, when you press on the plastic, you do feel like the plastic is also being pressed down. So this is still a really solid plastic. It does feel plasticky because of like the actual finishing texture on it, that it's like that, in my opinion. And but the buttons and all the layouts are actually very nicely laid out, and also very tactile buttons. I like that I do get feedback when I press on the buttons. I do feel the buttons being pressed, which is really nice. And also if you're working in an environment where you quickly have to set things, it is a nice feedback. It might not work well in gloves, but you know, with bare hands, it's still nice. It has a lot of things that you need to actually do basic photography things with, which is nice in my opinion. And if you're just really starting out, this is a great camera. And if it breaks or if it gets lost, 50 euros isn't really a lot. Yes, it does depending on where you live in terms of the year you buy this camera for, because a lot of times you can also get it for around 100 euros or even like under 50 euros. So yeah, but I got this in a really, really good condition for 50 euros. So I was really pleased. There is only one card slot, but you know, that is to be expected. It does take SD cards. Personally, I'm a fan of CF cards, but you know, most people I know loves SD cards. So yeah, there's that. The burst rate isn't really high on this camera, but I really like the shutter sound. It's kind of like a nice shutter sound that you kind of hear as well. Oh wait, the mic is over here. It's kind of like that classic Nikon shutter sound that I also really, really like, compared to like the Canon shutter sound on their earlier entry-level cameras, which is kind of like a loud pitch, high pitch shutter sound, which sounds kind of like cheesy or cliche shutter sound that you usually have standards on normal digital cameras. But anyway, another thing what I like about this camera is the ability to shoot RAW and JPEG at the same time. A lot of entry-level cameras back then either allows you to like either shoot in JPEG or RAW, but not both. But this camera allows you to shoot in JPEG and RAW at the same time. The one downside is I wish that, like, you know, for such a camera, even back then, I wish that you have different modes of RAW. There's only one RAW mode in this camera, but of course, being a cheap entry-level camera, it's kind of a luxury and nitpicking for me to actually nitpick on that point. But it's still a really, really, really nice feature that they offer RAW plus JPEG shooting on this particular camera. But at the end of the day, this camera will still produce really, really high image quality results. And yes, it's not going to be like the same 12 megapixels you find on the full frame A7S cameras. That will actually produce nicer files. But the 12 megapixel in this sensor is also nice. It's also a Sony sensor, by the way. But it's a really, really nice sensor that captures a lot of dynamic range. And to a lot of times, you will not really expect that it's from a D5000 or from such an old camera because of the dynamic range the sensor can actually output. Of course, you will have to work with it in post to like recover back a lot of its dynamic range, because straight out of the camera, it still looks somewhat old image, like lack of dynamic range. But with the details you can pull back, and also the amount of information you can pull back is just really, really nice for such a camera at this price point, and also for like an entry-level camera. So I think if you're just doing like basic portraits or really starting out in photography and trying to find out like which direction you want to go, I feel like that this camera is still a nice camera to really shoot and really grow and learn a lot in photography. There are a lot of setbacks and flaws with this camera, such as if you want to shoot in like long time lapse or long night exposure, it is a little bit difficult to shoot with this camera, but it will get its job done. It is a bit slower process, but you know, if you're really starting out, it's totally fine. And to a certain extent, you can still use this as like a backup camera for your like professional DSLR if you want to shoot weddings or events, things like that. This is not a fast camera still, but the image quality out of this camera is really great. I know a lot of like photographers who don't really or aren't able to afford like professional cameras. They use entry-level cameras, and this was one of their choices as well. And well, back in the day, of course, and they were really able to produce nice, amazing results with this camera that I was like, wow, it looks so good. And just to prove to you, like, there are also images on the magazine that was taken with a D5000, and to me, like, the actual images, they look really, really nice, and they look just fine. And you know, like, and it still will deliver really, really nice results for even modern day standards. You know, if it was on photography magazines before, it's already kind of like certified that, you know, you don't need to really be worried about the image quality of this camera. So yeah, give it a try. It doesn't really hurt to really spend this much money. If you lose it, or if you feel like photography is not for you, then yeah, it's still not a lot of investment that you invested in it, and you can still sell it and get pretty much the same amount of money back. Anyway, before this video gets too long, if you need a free photography guidebook, there's a link down in the description below. It's absolutely for free. It's on my website. I made it. You don't need to submit your email address. I will not send you any newsletter nonsense. Just click and download. It's absolutely for beginner, but it's also absolutely for free, so feel free to read if you want. And otherwise, thank you very, very much for watching. If you have any questions / suggestions or recommendations or whatever, just comment down in the comment section below. Thank you very, very much for watching again. Stay safe, have a nice day, have fun shooting. Bye for now.